Just to remind you, between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created 11 million federal jobs. He hired 11 million people to work for the federal government, using as his argument, if the private sector either cannot or will not hire people, then there's nothing else to do but have the government do it, and he did it. It's amazing in the United States, with that precedent of a past president doing that in this country. So we're not borrowing an idea from Russia or China or Cuba or anything like that. But we are so broken in terms of what the left here once was. The trade unions, the socialist economy, all the ones who made Roosevelt do that. We don't have their equivalent. We don't have an ascending union movement or a left political culture. And so we do not even have what a Roosevelt proved able to do. And I want to remind you, the President Roosevelt, who took that action, became the most popular, repeatedly elected president in the history of the United States. He won 4 consecutive presidential elections. The only reason we have a 2-term limit in this country was the horror of the Republican Party after he had died, he died in office, as you all know, to make it impossible for another Roosevelt, another hero of people who gave them the jobs to get them out of the Depression. So when you ask yourself, why wouldn't a president do that now? Why wouldn't a president seek to become as popular with such a program as the last one became who did it? Then you have to wonder who is calling what shots where in this society. But this crisis is with us. It is not going away. The chances of this program of the Federal Reserve failing are much greater than it's succeeding. They know that, and they don't have any more cards to play. And that's perhaps the scariest dilemma of all. Let me stop with that, and let's open it up. And if you have questions or comments, I'd be glad to try to respond or let it go back and forth among you. Yes?
So how did Roosevelt pay for that 7 years and 11 million jobs?
Very good. Roosevelt did 2 things to pay for it. He borrowed, because a direct assault on the people at the top would have been too dangerous, but he also taxed them. For those of you that are not familiar with the history of the United States, taxes on corporations shot up in the Great Depression. He went after them. Taxes on rich people shot up. By the end of the war, in the 1940s, the tax rate at the highest level, if you made the top, I think it was those days it was over 100,000, 125,000, your tax rate at the top was 91%. Let me make sure you understand that. At the top, for the really rich, every dollar over 150,000 or whatever it was in the cutoff at that point, the equivalent today is $400,000. Go back in time. But for the top rate, today, the top rate, every dollar you make over 400,000 a year is taxed at 35% now. Back then, the equivalent was taxed at 91%. Every dollar you earned over the top, 91 cents went to Washington. You kept 9. The American ruling class, the capitalist class, accepted that. Why? Because they were real scared that if they didn't get out of this depression, it wouldn't be the level of taxes that they'd have to worry about. It would be surviving physically they'd have to worry about. And it clears your mind when you face that kind of situation. And kind of look at the options you face and take a different position. Not all, but all. So the way Roosevelt paid for that program, borrowing, because he didn't want to push them too far, and raising their taxes. The whole history of taxation in the United States since the end of the Great Depression has been a relentless campaign, successful, to bring back down the tax rates on business and the tax rates on rich people from the high levels that were necessary to help get out of the Great Depression. The income tax, which was passed in the United States in 1910, was originally designed to impact only the top 2 or 3% of the income distribution. 98% were to be exempted. just the rich. The income tax was a tax on the rich. That's what it was designed to do. That's how it was argued and debated. The rich, having lost the effort to prevent it, then understood, okay, now we couldn't stop it, now we are going to fix it. And fixing it meant spreading it across the rest of the income distribution, moving it down step by step, so it became a broad-based tax on everybody, which is completely different from what it was originally organized and designed to do. It's only America as a political entity that permitted that to happen. It's only the way this country works that so many of even you in this room didn't know what I just told you. Don't even know that the tax structure used to be much more progressive than it is now. Yeah?
You mentioned that with the stimulus or the $600 billion, that one of the concerns is inflation. Even if prices stayed steady, most of the goods that we consume that aren't for food, for example, are imported goods regardless. So that would just stimulate outside economies anyways. So wouldn't that not work no matter what, pretty much?
Well, it wouldn't work, except their presumption is that the dollar will decline. And that as the dollar declines, by the way, just a footnote, the policy objective of the United States, everyone who pays attention knows that, is to smash down the level of the dollar. So for those of you that were thinking about making a trip to Europe, do it soon. Because the cost to doing that is going to go through the roof if they succeed. So their goal is to stimulate and keep more of that spending here, because the reduced dollar makes imported goods more expensive. And so we're hoping that that extra, but look how that looks to the rest of the world. It looks like what it is. We're boosting our enterprises here against theirs. But of course it's not we and against them. That's a struggle inside the United States. You must understand that. 60% of the goods coming to the United States from China are produced in China by subsidiaries of American corporations. Those American corporations, which are all our biggest ones, they have spent a fortune to invest in China. They spent a fortune to close their facilities in New Jersey and Indiana and Arkansas. And they're spending a fortune to build and hire people and consult and bribe officials. They are spending they do not want to lose that bit. They went to China because they want to sell those goods to Americans that they always sold, but make a bigger profit by paying low wages to get them produced. That's why they went to China. Their whole program will be defeated if the dollar drops relative to the Chinese currency. So the biggest obstacle for the government's program to cut the value of the dollar is the mammoth American corporations who are working night and day in Washington to make sure that does not happen. And that's the struggle that will determine the outcome of the dollar. The American people will be observers who do not understand what they're seeing. But that's the issue. Yeah.
What do you think about the possibilities of stagflation?
Stagflation, just for everyone to know, is the dream of people who provoke an inflation the way it's being done now is, as I told you, that it'll stimulate lots of purchases, and yes, the prices will go up, but a lot of people will get jobs. It is, of course, possible in a private enterprise economy that the private storekeepers, remember the story I told you before, will respond to the extra money in circulation because they print more by jacking up prices. Suppose they jack up prices so far that no extra goods are sold, no extra goods are purchased because the price went up so much that what's happened is all the extra purchasing power got soaked up in paying the higher prices, but no more goods were produced. Then there would be no increase in employment, that is, our unemployment would stagnate and stay, but we would have an inflation. The combination of rising prices with no extra production is called stagflation. It's an inflation together with stagnating production. If the inflation happens fast enough, for example, like in Germany, but even much slower than that crazy situation, then you could have a stagflation. That certainly is a possibility here. Once again, free private enterprise. It's a mantra in our culture. Free private enterprise means it is the freedom of each producer to set whatever price he wishes. So the producer who sees that the Federal Reserve is pumping money in the system can respond by raising prices. That decision by the private capitalist is undertaken to make money for him, but its social consequences can be a disaster. But that's what private enterprise always is. People who make private decisions with social consequences that they don't have to take any responsibility for. You're supposed to believe Adam Smith, that if each of us does what's best for ourselves, as if by magic, the hidden hand of God will make it all work out. Well, just in case there isn't such a hidden hand, I'm not even going to go to the next step, but if God is busy doing something else, then each of us taking care of ourselves doesn't produce the best outcome for everybody, it can produce the worst. Here's an example in which each business reacting in what's best for it, jacking up prices in this case, could produce stagflation. The worst possible outcome. The extra money doesn't get people back to work, but does produce a wild inflation. That's not what the Federal Reserve wants. But it is what the Federal Reserve risks, and they know that. Yeah.
They want to give people this money, I mean, they not give. I mean, that's what we should be saying, don't borrow and take. But how can lending people money doesn't, I mean, I don't exactly understand how lending the people money and not paying them can, I mean, they're giving the banks money.
Yes.
And the banks would normally lend to businesses.
And individuals, both. Remember, consumer lending has become a very large and important part. It wasn't 40 years ago. But one of the results of the last 30 years, remember the story? Wages didn't go up for 30 years, so the masses had to borrow to realize the American dream.
They've gone through that process and seen that the people don't have the money to pay it back with.
Oh, no, careful.
No.
They made a fortune for 30 or 40 years. You look at the money earned by Citibank, Bank of America, any of them, off of consumer lending, it was the growth for 30 years. They made a fortune. They didn't know how to stop. They didn't know how to take it to a point where it can't be sustained. They didn't want to face the fact that they were lending more and more money to people whose wages